When people think of the fine arts, they think of high society, refinement, and je ne sais quoi. But motherfucker, let me tell you, there are multiple fine artists of the past with rap sheets long enough to land them in the Grand Theft Auto cast. And today we're going to look at one such artist. So, if you're interested in murder, larceny, felony assault, public intoxication, and latent homoeroticism, please seek out the services of a therapist and a lawyer, but also stick around to learn about Caravaggio, the artistic murder hobo of Baroque Italy. Before we get into Caravaggio's life, we need to get into a brief side tangent about the Baroque period and why it's objectively my favorite part of European art history. In the early 1600s, a massive war was starting to brew between Catholicism and Protestantism. And war was in fact the term for it, because not only were they battling for your soul, they were battling for land. With swords and guns. The Catholic faith was losing in the court of public opinion, and losing badly at that. It was entirely their own fault too. The Catholic Church had spent hundreds of years at this point wasting tithe money and extorting people for the dead souls of their relatives in order to fund lavish church lifestyles while the poor languished. The churches of Protestantism, on the other paw, rejected adornment and expensive art, which spoke to the lower class in a way that lavish extravagance of high society Catholicism simply could not. The leaders of the Catholic faith in 1622, in a panic, assembled a body called the Congregatio de Propaganda Fide, Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith in English, and propaganda for short. Don't think too hard about that. What the propagandists concluded was that they were, in fact, getting their asses forthrightly tanned by the Protestants because they simply connected with the lower class far better than Catholic decadents ever could. But here's the fun part. Their course of action was to double down on the extravagance, but this time, they were going to do it differently.
We need to find a way to sell our extravagance to those filthy poor people, lovely people, lovely people. Those fucking guys. What are they like anyway?
Well, if, hypothetically, if I were a poor person, I'd hypothetically, completely hypothetically, want lots of sex, violence, decapitation, dark, moody shit filled with filthy poor people like me, just painted right up close so you can count all of their filthy, soot-filled pores, hypothetically.
Oh, of course.
And lots of slim naked men, like lots of them, just oiled up from head to toe, twinked up to the fucking nines, absolute fruitcakes.
I'm starting to think this isn't entirely hypothetical.
Yeah, sure, whatever. Now, I know what you're thinking. Nobody else has done stuff like this before. Luckily for you, Your Eminence, I am very intimately familiar with one such artist who we can look to. He died some 12 years ago, and he was an insufferable asshole when he was alive, but his style is just what you're looking for. Your Eminence, I bring you Caravaggio.
Oh, wow. Wow, this is brilliant. I love this. But you and I are gonna have to go to the confessional now so we can have a long conversation about your artistic viewing history.
Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio. No, not that Michelangelo. Not that one either. God damn. Caravaggio, the first Baroque painter, was born in a violent time of Italy's past, 1571 CE. When he was just a child, he lost both of his parents and almost every male member of his extended family to the bubonic plague. He then spent most of his childhood bouncing around from his hometown of Caravaggio to Milan, fighting, drinking, getting into trouble, and learning to paint. This is where Caravaggio's style started to diverge quite a bit. At the age of 12, Caravaggio signed a deal to become an apprentice under minor master Simone Peterzano. But Peterzano was an artist in the Mannerist style, and from what evidence we have, Caravaggio despised the Mannerist style's focus on what he called that weak ass shit. And so he ditched most of his studies in favor of learning the arts of horrific violence. He picked up dueling with a sword, a talent that would go on to get him in trouble on multiple occasions. On top of this, he'd frequently go to see the fiery sermons of a new class of archbishops who'd claimed that the world had grown too accustomed to luxury and pleasure, and that they needed to return to the traditions of poverty and suffering that Jesus was known for. Skipping right past the litany of obvious BDSM jokes I could make about the Catholic attachment to suffering, this fascination with poverty and suffering would soon carry itself on to Caravaggio's work. Despite mostly ignoring his studies, he'd, by some miracle, managed to learn enough about painting to make it on his own, and it was a good thing he did, because he'd have to book it out of Milan to head to Rome in 1592 on account of murdering a town guard. Maybe. In his defense, it's not entirely clear that he did it, just that he was absolutely, definitely involved, somehow. In any case, he'd never return to any city in Lombardy ever again. When he arrived in Rome, he quickly got frustrated with a starving artist gig and decided to go all in on a very risky bet. One day, he approached a wealthy man by the name of Francesco Cardinal Maria del Monte with an experimental painting titled The Card Sharps. Observe here, a young man with fine, wealthy clothes is enticed to the card table by this old, poor gentleman. You can tell he's poor because he has the tan skin of a field laborer and he's up to no good. It's It's the 1590s. We're gonna run into worrying stereotypes a lot. Anyway, this gentleman with holes in his gloves that are totally not for feeling marked cards gives a signal to the other young chap who's about to pass him cards that guarantee the rich young man loses all his money on this bet. Now, this was a very risky painting for Caravaggio to show Del Monte for two reasons. The first and lesser one is that poor people just weren't really a subject of art at the time, but the second and way funnier reason is that Caravaggio was, essentially, attempting to entice the money out of a wealthy man's pockets by showing him a painting of poor people enticing the money out of a wealthy man's pockets. Now, Del Monte either didn't recognize this joke or greatly appreciated the humor in it, because by some unholy miracle, it landed Caravaggio an apartment and a conveyor belt of more wealthy people to feed him commissions. And in between commissions, Del Monte would encourage Caravaggio to get real weird with it. And get weird with it he did. He painted this painting of a male prostitute dressed as Bacchus, with each of the various foods around him meant to imply in many ways that this male prostitute is akin to Jesus, and offering some kind of salvation. And goddamn Caravaggio, do I know the feeling of trying to find salvation in skinny twinks. Oh, right. Caravaggio is very likely some flavor of queer. The sheer number of scantily clad and helpless twinks in his artwork leave very little to the imagination on that front. For something a little less homoerotic, we can look to the penchant that Caravaggio developed for beheadings. Actually, he ended up making that homoerotic too, but don't worry, we'll get to that. This is Caravaggio's Head of Medusa, and it could technically be considered one of the first pieces of conceptual artwork. This circular board it's mounted to has a strap on the back so that when the wearer straps it to their arm, they see the severed head of Medusa like a reflection in the shield, making them feel like the Greek hero Perseus. Neat! What's not so neat, however, was the ever-growing list of crimes under Caravaggio's belt. Even if we give him the benefit of the doubt on the whole murder in Milan thing, he was arrested in 1598 for the unlawful carry of the sword. And then there was the many bar fights he'd get himself into. He'd gotten into so many of these things by this point that his reputation on the street was mainly one of scorn, and it was likely there in the dimly lit bars and the hungover mornings in jail where he discovered his favorite painting technique, and one that would come to define the Baroque period that he fathered, chiaroscuro. Look here. A single, uniform point of high-intensity lighting, contrasted with the intense darkness of the background, creates a heightened sense of drama in the work. A kind of half-light, if you will. This shit right here. Mwah! Chef's kiss. I love this. I want to see more furry artwork with this. And apparently the people of Rome wanted more of this too. When he used this technique and combined it with biblical figures in contemporary dress, the Italian art consumers felt like Bible stories had been brought into the then and there. Look at Caravaggio's Taking of the Christ. Jesus, Judas, John, and Peter are dressed in 16th century clothes. The guards arresting Jesus are in contemporary plate armor. Imagine if Christian artists today painted a buzz-cut white man in fucking Oakleys and a bulletproof vest with a thin blue line patch arresting Jesus. That would be such a fucking statement. Unfortunately, the Christian artists of our time are a wee bit busy painting gonzo shit like this. Fine, enough of my personal obsession with chiaroscuro and the batshit insanity of John McNaughton. You came here for crime. One day in 1604, Caravaggio was busy celebrating the completion of his latest painting, Amor Vincit Omnia, when his successes began to invoke the envy of NPC Giovanni Baglione, who proceeded to draw a sexual cartoon of Caravaggio dressed as the devil sodomizing Cupid. Someone please make a furry YCH of this. It would be so funny. Anyway, Caravaggio didn't like this, so he wrote a satirical poem where he called Giovanni Baglione Giovanni Goglione, which roughly translates to Johnny Nutsack. Johnny Nutsack did not like this and had Caravaggio arrested for libel. They'd stopped drawing each other as the soy jack and managed to beat the allegations by 1604, but the very next year he'd go on to be arrested for carrying a sword in a public place, defacing the house of a noblewoman, grievous bodily harm, skipping bail to go to the beach, and defacing the house of a noblewoman again. Finally, in 1605, he'd gone too far, even by his own standards, when he got into an argument with another artist named Ranuccio Tomassoni, which culminated in a duel to the death on a tennis court, where Caravaggio stabbed Tomassoni in the femoral artery. The specific place you intended to stab someone in a duel was supposed to carry a meaning about the way they had wronged you, and there's a chance Caravaggio was trying to stab Tomassoni in the dick because he might have bragged about fucking Tomassoni's wife. Truly, the Renaissance was the height of cultural nobility. So, Tomassoni died, obviously, and Caravaggio, not being entirely an idiot, decided now was the time to skip town. Because all of this made him guilty of murder, and anyone in the Papal States now had the right to kill him with impunity. He fled south, presumably whilst riding a white Bronco, and hightailed it to Colonia where he'd make vent art for a bit. Here is David with the head of Goliath. Skinny twink, likely a prostitute. Severed head he's holding is a self-portrait of Caravaggio. It's not hard to analyze what Caravaggio meant here. Won't judge the man, we've all been there. Wait, actually, no, fuck that. We've not all been there. What the fuck, Caravaggio? The painter quickly decided that Cologne was not far enough from Rome for him to feel safe. So he fled further south to Naples, where he'd paint a lot of altarpieces before coming up with a harebrained scheme to flee to Malta and gain knighthood in order to be officially pardoned for his crimes. He got there and painted St. Jerome writing, portrait of Fra Antonio Martelli, and portrait of Olaf de Wignacourt with his page boy, in order to gain favor with various knights of the Order of Malta. By sheer dumb luck, this gamble worked, and the Pope himself granted Caravaggio a pardon to join the Knights of Malta in 1608. To celebrate, he painted... That's right, another beheading! In The Beheading of St. John, Caravaggio replaces Herod from the original story with a Turkish officer overseeing the beheading of the disciple. The message here is very obviously a wartime message for the Knights of Malta about what would happen if they ever failed in their defense of the island against the Ottomans. He even had his signature written in blood spurting from John the Baptist's neck. So Caravaggio had his pardon. He had a very prestigious knighthood in the bag. All he had to do was keep his cool and not fuck this up.
All I have to do is nothing.
Anyway, Caravaggio attacked and wounded one of his senior officers with a pistol on the day that his painting was supposed to be unveiled. He was promptly thrown into a cell, but escaped and fucked off to Sicily. In his absence, the Knights of Malta quickly retracted his knighthood, his pardon, and his protection. That senior officer he shot? Yeah, he started to hunt Caravaggio down all across Sicily and Italy for the few short years that he'd have remaining. Caravaggio would only go on to live for 2 more years, painting increasingly depressing and haunting scenes like his Adoration of the Shepherds and, very interesting to me, his Resurrection of Lazarus, where I personally get the impression that Lazarus is in agony for having to keep on living. Like Caravaggio is trying to tell us that he'd just rather be dead. Which I get, but like, Caravaggio, it's you. You're the problem. He wouldn't continue to be the problem for long, though. Soon after painting that Resurrection of Lazarus, he was caught outside of a shitty tavern in Naples called the Osteria del Seriglio. 4 attackers, one of them likely being the officer he'd shot in Malta, held him down and sliced open his face. This was a very common way to wound an enemy out of revenge, and a scar on the face was supposed to signify a besmirchment upon your honor. But the Maltese gangsters cut his face in such a way that the wound would slowly and painfully be the one that killed Caravaggio. But not before he could pick up his brush and paint one last time. This is the martyrdom of Saint Ursula. In the original story, Saint Ursula traveled to Cologne with 11,000 virgins, and when she rejected the advances of the commander of the Huns attacking the city, the commander had her slain with an arrow. In Caravaggio's rendition, however, the Hun commander is almost shocked and perplexed at the death wrought by his own actions. Caravaggio painted himself in this one too, right here, straining to get a look at the whole thing, but I think the commander himself is the one who's actually acting as the stand-in for the painter's feelings. He's painted raggedly, either by intention or by a terrible bout of tremors that rocked Caravaggio's hands by this point in his hospitalization. He's horrified. He looks like someone who's realized he had a good thing, ruined it with his own violent tendencies, and threw innocent people into the throes of death over petty squabbles. Caravaggio would die very soon after completing this painting, due to an infection in the wound that he'd gotten from his face. Yeah, I'm sorry, Caravaggio. It's beautiful. It's haunting. It's my favorite painting in your portfolio, but come on, man. It's too little, too late, and the common denominator in all of your problems has been you this entire time. Caravaggio, good lord, you had so many opportunities to grow and prosper, and you took none of them. I love reading about the life of Caravaggio because it's just this self-fulfilling tragedy of a man who was so caught up in his own ego and masculinity that he took every single gift that was given to him and threw it away for the sake of petty vitriol. And yeah, maybe the toxic masculinity of Renaissance nobility culture had something to do with it, but my god, even that couldn't explain this level of self-inflicted misery. I suppose that the biggest thing we can learn from the life of Caravaggio is that discretion is the better part of valor. There's so many forces in this world that are determined to convince you to sell your life and happiness down the river. And there's absolutely a time and place where retaliation is warranted and good, but take a moment. Think about what there really is to be gained and lost. Listen to what your volition is telling you, and you might just find that the best option is to roll your eyes, walk away, and be happy. Because living a good, happy life where your talents and gifts and personality can shine around people who actually appreciate it is far more important than throwing it all away over some made-up notion of honor or masculinity. You all have been wonderful. I've been Pip. Thanks to Lock the Cat for lending his voice as Pope Gregory the 15th. And I want you all to know that I'm going to try to start branching out into slightly more heartfelt, original, maybe even emotional videos. But don't worry, the history essays you know and love are here to stay. Goodbye!